Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me in this discussion of the movements of the synovial joints. And so when we talk about each individual synovial joint, or some of the major ones, say TMJ, elbow, shoulder, etc., we're going to talk about the actions that can occur at these joints, because that's really important. You can see if there's some loss in range of motion, that type of stuff, that can be clinically as well as functionally important. So we need to understand what those movements actually mean. We're going to begin with the discussion of what is anatomical position, and then we're going to touch on some of the big picture highlights of the 6 types of synovial joints. We're not going to get into nitty-gritty details of each one because that's going to come up in later discussions. All right, so before we do this, though, we really need to talk about what anatomical position is. And this has been introduced to you, but I want to bring it back up here again, because a lot of these movements, you have to understand that that's being discussed with anatomical position in mind. And so not only musculoskeletal is this important, but this is true throughout the entirety of the discussion of anatomy. So what is it? Okay, so this individual is really showing you anatomical position. An individual is standing, their head is facing forward, their toes are facing anteriorly. Those things make sense. And the feet are parallel. But one thing that sometimes doesn't make as much sense is that these palms are going to be facing anteriorly. And that's not really a natural position that we stand. We don't naturally stand with our palms facing anteriorly. But the reasoning behind this is that the bones in the forearm, the radius and the ulna, are not crossed over one another at that point. If your palms are facing anteriorly, the radius and the ulna are going to be parallel to one another, and thus that's anatomical position. So all these discussions that we're going to have, I want you to be thinking about from anatomical position. And a few just reminders in terms of planes, because this is important. If you think the median plane, this is kind of going right down the midline region. It's going to split the body into right and left halves. And then you can have multiple sagittal planes that are kind of on either side of that. So think a vertical plane here. A coronal plane or frontal plane, you'll hear it either way, will split the body into anterior and posterior parts. Okay? So some of these actions you'll be thinking about occurring in more of a frontal plane or say more of a sagittal plane. And then of course the reminder of the transverse or axial plane, excuse me, will split the body into superior and inferior parts. And you can have multiple transverse or axial planes, similar with the frontal planes and sagittal planes. Okay, so let's start with flexion and extension, because typically this is one of the easier ones to conceptualize. And this typically occurs in a sagittal plane. Okay, the sagittal suture is going to be located here, splitting the body into right and left halves. And flexion literally means, flex means to bend. So what we are doing here is decreasing the angle between articulating bones. I always thinking around the elbow joint region, that's one of the easiest to conceptualize. Flexion, think about you're reducing the angle right here in this particular joint. And extension is to stretch out. It will increase the angle between articulating bones. And oftentimes extension is a restoration to anatomical position, but not necessarily so. And in fact, you can hyperextend past anatomical position. So most synovial joints of the body can flex and extend. So the simplest one, say like in terms of a hinge joint, that is going to only be capable of flexion and extension. Abduction and adduction, and often you'll hear me spell out abduction or adduction because these two terms sound so similar. This typically occurs in that frontal plane or coronal plane, so splitting that body into anterior and posterior positions. And abduction, I'm going to stand up for this one. Abduction, you're moving away from the body. And adduction, you're moving back towards the body. And you can even come kind of past anatomical position. So abduction is typically away from the midline. And then you can think of I'm adding adduction back to the body. All right. So that's abduction and adduction. Now, if you can flex, extend, abduct, and adduct, or say flex, abduction, extension, adduction, or in the opposite order, if you can do those 4 movements, you can circumduct. And really all this is just a complex angular movement that involves these actions happening in a sequential motion and allowing for an individual to circumduct. So quite, there's going to be many of the types of synovial joints that can do these 4 types of movements. And anytime you can do all 4, you can circumduct. I say I can even do it here with this joint. But oftentimes we think of it more, say with the shoulder joint or with the hip joint, but some of those smaller joints can do it as well. Now, rotation is when a bone revolves around its own longitudinal axis. And this one is a little bit more conceptually difficult. So think about pivoting or rotating. One of the ones that kind of comes up first in mind to me is the atlanto-occipital joint, or the one that's associated with the head, the atlantoaxial joint as well. This is going to allow you to say no. So you think about there's that rotation of C1 and C2 around one another, those cervical vertebrae, to allow me to say no. Okay, that's rotation. Now, when we're thinking about the appendicular skeleton, this can occur in certain joints as well, some of the more complex or more freely movable joints. And you can have, this type of rotation is often referred to as medial or internal rotation. I always think of flexing the elbow. That kind of allows you to conceptualize what's going on in the shoulder joint. So if you medially rotate, this portion of the humerus is going to move more medial or internally. If you laterally rotate or externally rotate, that's going to kind of move away or move more posteriorly there. Okay, so you have medial rotation or lateral rotation. And generally the terms internal or external are used more more clinically. So if you hear this more in a clinic, whereas medial and lateral rotation are more anatomical terms. All right, so let's real quickly touch base in terms of some of these joints. So the most freely movable are going to be your ball and socket joints. So you have literally a ball type articulating surface of the bone and a socket portion. The hip joint is a great example, and then the shoulder joint is going to be the most freely movable of the joints. And so these types of joints are capable of flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction, as well as both medial and lateral rotation. So really capable of all those actions. Condyloid joints, as well as saddle joints, are going to be capable of flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction, but not rotation. Okay, so condyloid and saddle joints, really the best example of a saddle joint is between the trapezium and the first metacarpal and the thumb region. Condyloid joints are found kind of throughout the body, but one of the best examples is at the wrist joint, where that radius of the forearm is articulating with that proximal row of carpal bones. So that's a condyloid joint. And these are really named just based on the shape of those articulating bones. So say with the saddle joint, one of those bones looks like a saddle, and the other bone kind of sits within that saddle. All right, a hinge joint is only capable of flexion and extension. Kind of the main example of that here is at this elbow joint or the humeral-ulnar joint. The knee joint is also an example of a hinge joint. It's a modified hinge joint, so there's a little bit more that can occur there, but the main action is going to be flexion and extension. Pivot joints are going to be capable of rotation. So between, like I was mentioning before, the C1 and C2 vertebrae, allowing us to say no. Though that's going to be an example of a pivot joint, but say like C1 and C2, you're not really having much flexion and extension occurring there. And then lastly, one of the more simplistic joints, but very important in terms of really allowing other joints surrounding it to have full range of motion, are what's referred to as plane joints. And the articulating surfaces of plane joints are going to be relatively flat. And literally, this is just allowing kind of a sliding and gliding movement to occur between the articulating bones. So as mentioned, these are not huge movements in terms of what's happening there, but that movement and those bones will allow, say, the shoulder joint to be able to move a bit more. And we'll talk about those specific examples of plane joints when we get to some of those more important ones. All right, excellent. So this isn't the first time you're going to hear these 6 types of synovial joints. When we talk about each one of the more complex or relevant synovial joints, we'll talk about which type of synovial joint it is as well. Excellent. So that leads us to our question. All right, movement away from the midline in the frontal or coronal plane, that plane that splits the anterior and posterior portions of the body, is which type of angular movement? Okay, so pause the video. And when you're ready, let's talk about this. So the stem here really is key. So movement away from the midline in that frontal and coronal plane is which type of movement? All right, so abduction, I like the sound of that. We'll come back to this one. Adduction is movement towards the midline, so that's not right. Flexion and extension, this typically occurs in the sagittal plane, so this isn't correct. And circumduction is really this complex movement of these 2 movements along with these 2 movements, so that's not the correct answer. So abduction or abduction is going to be the correct answer here. So abduction A is the correct answer. All right, so if it is possible for you at some point to kind of work through these actions with yourself or with a partner to kind of act out, that can be really helpful in terms of conceptualizing these. And again, this is something that's going to come up quite often in terms of being able to understand what flexion extension means, what abduction, adduction, circumduction, as well as a little bit more complex, but also important rotation. Thank you so much for your time and attention here. As always, if you have any questions, please reach out. Thanks for your time.